In the dazzling splendor of ancient Rome, beneath the polished marble columns and the shimmering grandeur of its golden palaces, lay a disturbing truth, one that history often chooses to ignore. While modern narratives glorify Rome's legendary military victories, architectural brilliance, and foundational legal systems, seldom do we discuss the hidden cost of this imperial magnificence, the silent suffering of those forced into submission to uphold it. Among the most tragic of these were young males condemned to serve as concubines for the empire's elite. These were not mere house slaves or simple attendants. These were human beings, coerced into roles shaped not by ability, but by beauty, age, and sheer vulnerability, trapped in a system that demanded their subservience for the intimate amusement of Rome's powerful aristocracy. Their stories uncover a grim dimension of Roman life, one that confronts our sanitized, glorified version of antiquity with the harshness of exploitation and subjugation. It was a world where strength dictated morality, and the powerless were voiceless. Before we delve into these untold chronicles of endurance, fear, and pain, if you're someone who seeks the forgotten sides of history, the ones that textbooks leave behind, be sure to tap the like button and subscribe for more historical truth. And feel free to comment where in the world you're listening from. I'm always fascinated that we're uncovering these ancient truths together, spanning centuries and continents, united by our shared curiosity for the past. The Romans held a concept of companionship that deviated sharply from modern ethical understanding. Today, we distinguish clearly between consent and coercion. In ancient Rome, the lines were blurred, smothered beneath a rigid hierarchy where power was the deciding factor. At the very bottom of this pyramid were young boys, many seized during military campaigns or born into bondage, who found themselves forced into roles they neither chose nor understood. Barely adolescents, some not even through puberty, these youths were selected not for intellect or skill, but for their looks and perceived ability to entertain. They lived each day unsure of what the next would bring, when they would be summoned, what would be expected of them, and whether compliance meant safety or new suffering. Refusal was rarely an option. Submission wasn't just encouraged, it was essential for survival. The process of being selected was itself an act of dehumanization. Affluent Roman men would walk through slave markets as though they were inspecting livestock. These markets resembled auctions more than anything, where buyers evaluated the physical features, ethnicity, and age of potential concubines. Young Greek males were often admired for their supposed refinement, while Germanic boys were desired for their pale features and sturdy physiques. Meanwhile, the boys stood exposed, frightened, and powerless, evaluated as property in a public display of disregard for their humanity. Once purchased, these young men entered homes where they no longer owned their bodies, time, or privacy. They were expected to be constantly available, ready to fulfill desires unspoken, to anticipate needs before they were asked. And most tragically, they were required to pretend willingness, smile, show gratitude, and act pleased, while their basic dignity was stripped from them daily. Their personal suffering had to be masked behind a performance of servitude. Life as a concubine varied by household, but every version had a cost. Some were kept in opulent quarters, adorned in elegant fabrics, given music lessons or philosophical instruction, not out of generosity, but because those refinements enhanced their role. Others were treated no better than cattle, summoned when needed, ignored when not, forced to exist in confined, impersonal spaces without belongings or connection to their pasts. What made their plight uniquely cruel was the complete absence of legal defense. Roman laws, complex as they were, offered limited protections even to slaves. But male concubines existed in a legal blind spot, where a master's pleasure superseded all rights, and any appeal to justice was unthinkable. They couldn't plead with courts, form bonds with peers, or even speak of their pain without risking worse. Yet, it wasn't only the physical control that left scars. The psychological warfare was often worse. Masters used manipulative tactics to erode their autonomy and instill dependence. Temporary favors would be extended, perhaps a day of kindness, a gift, or permission to rest, only to be ripped away for minor infractions. This created a mental state of instability where fear and hope coexisted cruelly. In some houses, concubines were deliberately isolated, not allowed to converse freely with servants or others in bondage, so they would remain emotionally fragmented. This was especially devastating for boys torn from their families, as it denied them the human connections necessary to cope or remember who they once were. To make matters worse, the environment was often competitive. Masters would pit their concubines against one another, intentionally or otherwise, forcing them to vie for approval, attention, or mercy. This bred jealousy, betrayal, and desperation. For many, there was no room for solidarity or friendship. What was a male concubine in the Roman Empire? A forgotten identity. He was never meant to be remembered. That was exactly the design. Purchased, washed, renamed. If spoken of at all, it was only in hushed tones. Not a slave, not in the usual sense. Not a citizen, never. Not a child, for long. He became something entirely different. A male concubine, a possession of Rome's ruling class, a boy who served behind closed doors, in rooms time chose not to recall. We know of gladiators, of emperors, senators, and scholars, but Rome was built on silence too, and in that silence, boys like him existed, then disappeared. This is not the tale of just one. This is the story of thousands. Boys who poured the wine, danced on command, led without mercy, and vanished without a grave. The empire of flesh, Rome functioned like a vast machine, not only conquering territories but consuming people. Beneath the splendor of gold and marble thrived a brutal industry of bodies. Some were taken for toil, others for sport, and many for pleasure. Pleasure stood as an unspoken foundation of Roman dominance. Behind every parade, every banquet, every victory, lurked the invisible. Concubines. Boys were chosen not for battle, but for softness of skin, voice, manner. Not born to fight, but to obey. They weren't sold to brothels. They were reserved for private use, often in the homes of Rome's most powerful. They didn't sleep on the streets, but inside villas. They weren't shackled with iron, but wrapped in silk. Yet their captivity ran deeper than chains. The taking. He might have been born in Cappadocia, or Judea, perhaps Numidia. The scrolls don't say. He came from the edges, where Rome's shadow reached last, but longest. He was 11 when chosen. A tax official's assistant marked him too delicate to send to the fields. His father owed a debt. His mother wept. Neither could stop it. He was loaded into a cart with other boys, all silent, none aware of what awaited. Rome didn't need to scar their skin. Their conditioning would leave its own mark. Rebirth in silence. In a villa near Naples, he was immersed in goat milk and honey, his hair trimmed and oiled. His name, foreign and sharp, was replaced with something soft and Latin. He was forbidden from speaking it again. They trained him in movement, not to walk, but to float, to serve wine without meeting a gaze, to read a look without reacting. A eunuch named Hilarion became his mentor. Only speak if you're addressed, he warned. Only cry when you're alone. Never refuse, not even with your eyes. The boy learned quickly. Those who didn't simply vanished. The first time, spring brought his transfer to Rome. They called it a gift. Not to him, of course. The recipient? A senator from Hispania. Old, jovial, and red-cheeked from too much pomegranate wine. The boy wore a sheer linen tunic. He was ordered to dance, and not stop, until the senator said so. It wasn't his first time being touched, but it was the first moment he understood. He would never again own that touch. He returned to the servants' quarters and vomited. No one asked why. No one needed to. A life of appearances. On the surface, life looked good. He wore Tyrian purple, slept on downy mats, ate figs and lamb glazed in spice. But none of it was his. Not the bed, not the food, not even the skin he lived in. He was summoned as needed for kings, generals, even bards. He learned to laugh at bad jokes, to smile through pain, to fade away when dismissed. His reward? Perhaps a bracelet, perhaps a bruise. He was told he was fortunate, and maybe in Rome he was. He was still breathing. For now, the others, he wasn't alone. There were many, boys with bright eyes and brief lives. Some went mad, some faded into silence. One, Nico, leapt from a balcony. They said it was an accident, but everyone knew. Another, Vibius, bit a guest's hand. They beat him until he couldn't stand. By morning, he was gone. They said he'd been reassigned. No one believed that. The imperial chambers. Then came the palace summons, a sign the emperor had noticed. He was dressed in robes stitched with gold. Kohl ringed his eyes. Perfume clung to him until he could smell nothing else. The emperor was younger than expected, and more cruel. He was given as a birthday jest, a gag among men with too much power. He wasn't permitted to speak, only to smile. And he did, even after the laughter ended. Especially then. Wrought in the marble, the palace gleamed, polished stone and radiant light. But beneath, it decayed. Whispers spread, of screams behind locked doors, of feasts halted by sudden deaths, of games stained with blood. He once saw a cart pass, a linen-covered body, smaller than his own. He said nothing, but something inside him cracked. That night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, and in the cracks between painted gods, he glimpsed his own fate. The breaking point, he turned 16, and everything hurt, less from pain, more from exhaustion. Bruises no longer shocked him. Silence no longer frightened him. Even the emperor felt unreal, just a cold statue with eyes. One evening, after a visiting general made a request, the boy collapsed. His body refused to rise. His mouth couldn't form a smile. Physician came. One glance and said, "Too thin, too many bruises." No treatment was offered. A whisper of escape. An older slave girl, forgotten by most, dabbed his face with a wet cloth. She shared a tale. "Once," she said, "a boy like you slipped into the aqueducts, through the kitchen, past the guards. He never returned. So maybe he made it." That night, when the villa buzzed with drunken laughter, he moved, past the dogs, past the guards, through the kitchens, to the aqueduct gate. He ran, through sewage, through shadows, through every ghost that ever haunted him. The shore. He reached the coastline after days. No one came after him. No one ever did. A fishing village took him in. They didn't speak Latin, only the language of wind, bread, and salt. He slept on rocks. He ate scraps. He learned to row. And over time, his spine forgot how to bow. His soft hands turned coarse. He never spoke of what he had been, but each night he remembered. The scroll. Years slipped by. He aged, not old, just enough to know silence was a slow killer. So he wrote, not to blame, not to beg, but to remember what happened to him, to the others, to the boys without names or headstones. He sealed the scroll in an urn, buried beneath a stone, tucked behind a fisherman's shack. Roman Empire, the hidden role of male slaves. In the heart of ancient Rome, beneath the arches of colosseums and the echoes of Senate debates, lived a population whose voices were never recorded, yet whose presence built the empire from the ground up. We know their names only as shadows, slaves, but not just any slaves, male slaves whose labor, loyalty, and suffering shaped the very machinery of Roman civilization. When we speak of Roman slaves, the mind conjures images of chained workers in fields or gladiators fighting in arenas. But the truth is far more complex and far more chilling. These men were not just muscle and might. They were scribes, tutors, secretaries, bodyguards, entertainers, and at times, something even more intimate. In a world ruled by hierarchy and dominance, the role of the male slave blurred the lines between labor and loyalty, servitude and survival. This is their story, untold, often uncomfortable, and deeply human. The hidden role of male slaves in the Roman Empire was not one of mere obedience. It was foundational, and yet history has tried to forget them. But today, we remember. Rome was not built in a day, but it was built on backs. By the 1st century CE, slavery had become the economic engine of the Roman world. Historians estimate that 1 out of every 3 people in Rome was a slave. That means nearly 1 million human beings, captured, sold, inherited, or born into bondage, supported the daily life of the city. Among them, male slaves filled critical roles in every corner of society. In the countryside, they toiled as agricultural laborers, digging, sowing, and harvesting the empire's grain supply under the scorching Mediterranean sun. On construction sites, they hauled stone to erect the monuments whose ruins we marvel at today. In the military, they carried the baggage of Roman legions, cooked for officers, or even served in non-combat roles under strict supervision. But the deeper one entered Roman society, the more refined and disturbing the roles became. In the homes of the elite, male slaves were body servants, expected to dress, groom, and accompany their masters everywhere. In urban households, they acted as scribes, accountants, and doormen. A select few were educated and literate, forced to serve as tutors to aristocratic Roman children. And the more powerful the master, the more perilous the role. For high-ranking Romans, slaves were the keepers of secrets, handling correspondence, managing estates, and sometimes even witnessing conspiracies and political murders. But they could never speak of what they saw, because silence was survival. Before they could serve, they were sold. The Roman slave market was a cold, calculated theater of human appraisal. Male slaves were inspected like livestock, teeth checked, muscles squeezed, limbs flexed. Their origins, whether from Greece, Egypt, Gaul, or Africa, determined their price. A Greek male, educated and refined, fetched more than a tribal captive from Germania. Traders used signs hung around their necks, tutuli, to advertise traits, can read and write, excellent cook, or more darkly, no history of escape. They were displayed on platforms like goods, with buyers circling like hawks. It wasn't just farmers and merchants browsing. Wealthy senators, military officers, and temple officials searched for men who could not only obey, but also impress, intellectually, aesthetically, and submissively. Some were bought for their brute strength, others for their voices, still others for what their masters saw in their silence. Many young men, boys, really, were selected specifically for their looks. These would become personal attendants, or worse, concubines. They were not bought to speak, only to serve. Once purchased, a slave was stripped of his name, his language, and often his family. In Roman law, he was not a person, he was property, and he would remain that way until death or rare manumission. Step inside a Roman domus, the elite household, and you'll find a world run not by masters, but by male slaves. At sunrise, the cubicularius, a bedroom attendant, quietly wakes his dominus, laying out his tunic and sandals. In the atrium, another slave lights the morning lamps, while yet another prepares breakfast. In the study, a librarius, often a former Greek tutor, transcribes letters and records expenses. In the kitchen, culinary slaves prepare meals from recipes imported from Asia Minor and North Africa. Near the front door stands the ostiarius, the gatekeeper, always watching, never speaking out of turn. And in the shadows, a boy waits, not older than 15, his job unclear to outsiders. These men formed the nervous system of the Roman household. They were expected to be invisible yet omnipresent, always anticipating needs, always available, never resting. To show fatigue was to invite punishment. To show defiance was to risk death. Some slaves built relationships of trust with their masters. They became confidants, stewards, even lovers. But that trust was a leash, not a bond. No matter how long they served, they could never forget their status. One mistake, one word overheard, and they could be reassigned, sold, or executed on a whim. Even in comfort, they walked on knives. There was one role more dangerous than all the rest. To be a concubiness, a male concubine, was to live at the mercy of Rome's most powerful men. These slaves weren't bought for skill or intellect. They were chosen for appearance, for demeanor, for silence. Kept in the private quarters of emperors, generals, and wealthy merchants, they were dressed in silk, perfumed, and trained in etiquette. They attended feasts, ceremonies, and private gatherings, always just a step behind, always within reach. Some were eunuchs, others simply young. All were vulnerable. Roman society did not view these relationships as romantic or consensual. They were displays of power, dominance masked as decorum. The concubine could be replaced as easily as a wine cup. Historical records remain cryptic. Names rarely survive, but whispers echo from Suetonius, Tacitus, and Juvenal of emperors with harems of boys, of generals who paraded their favorites in public, of artists who took their muses by force. One boy was gifted to Emperor Nero on his birthday. Another was said to have been executed for resisting a guest at a banquet. No law protected them. No family claimed them. And when they died, their stories died too. Yet not all male slaves were passive victims. In the quiet moments of servitude, some resisted. Not with violence, that meant certain death, but through subversion, sabotage, and stories. Some poisoned masters who abused them. Others passed secrets between households, becoming unseen couriers of political rumors and rebellion. A few even led revolts, though history records them only when they failed. The most famous, of course, is Spartacus, a Thracian gladiator who turned slave and rebelled. But Spartacus was not alone. Across Roman provinces, small uprisings flared, brief sparks in the darkness. And some resisted in quieter ways, by teaching their native languages to other slaves, by carving secret symbols into the walls of servant quarters, by singing songs that Rome could not translate. To be a slave was to be erased. To resist was to be remembered. Not all male slaves died in chains. A small number, a privileged few, were granted manumission. Freedom could come through years of service, through favor with a master, or through buying one's own liberty with earned coin peculium. Manumitted men became freedmen, liberti. They gained limited rights, could marry, own property, and sometimes even accumulate wealth. Some became merchants, scribes, or artisans. Others stayed in service as clients, tied to their former masters in a complex web of loyalty and status. But freedom was never truly free. A freedman's children could become citizens, but the freedman himself remained stained by servile origins. The stigma lingered in whispers, in Senate debates, in marble epitaphs that never quite forgot where he came from. And many male slaves never made it that far. They died in silence, buried in unmarked graves, their names lost, their stories unspoken. But here and there, archaeologists find their voices again, carved into forgotten stones, painted on villa walls, or preserved in dusty scrolls. A boy named Felix, a scribe named Tiro, a lover named Eros. Names finally remembered. History is written by the powerful, and in Rome, power wore the mask of civilization, marble statues, flowing togas, epic poetry. But behind that mask were millions of lives erased by silence. The male slaves of Rome were not footnotes. They were the foundation. They poured the wine at banquets that changed the world. They taught the sons of senators to read. They whispered Latin into the ears of emperors as they dressed them for war. They bore the weight of an empire on their backs and were denied even the dignity of remembrance. But now we remember. We speak their names when we find them. We tell their stories as best we can. We listen to the echoes beneath the arches, and we honor the boys, the men, the unnamed, who endured. If this story moved you, share it. If it challenged what you thought you knew about Rome, subscribe. Because beneath every empire's marble facade is a story built not on glory, but on bodies. And it's time we told the truth.